and share the first doc on the agenda. We have, looks like, a decent sized agenda today, so we may want to do some time boxing. I'm going to tentatively say let's limit ourselves to 15 minutes on this one, because I think we could probably talk for many hours on it, and then not get to anything else. So we'll go to 10:20 maybe, and then try and cut it off from there. And we can, of course, revisit offline or whatever. Cool. So this doc, it's kind of long. I definitely won't go through all of it because it goes through some a lot of stuff, and it's not necessarily formally complete. What I have is essentially a kind of trying to convince folks that the current way we're doing things in Ambient isn't ideal, and then propose at a high level what I think would be better to do, and then give some insight on how we might go about doing that. The thing that is very much not concrete or anywhere near finalized, even a legitimate proposal really, is the details on how we implement the high-level proposal. So I'll share kind of a very rough sketch, but it's very obviously meant to be replaced with something better as we discuss and iterate and even decide if we want to do this. So if we look back at Ambient, and like how we design things, like in the original Ambient design, it was really focused on compatibility with Istio sidecars. Like at one point before the initial launch, it was even still a one-to-one proxy to application architecture. It just wasn't as a sidecar container. We had like this sidecar pod idea. Just talking like very early drafts. And over time, we've kind of iterated more and more and drifted further away from complete compatibility, right? Like at some point, we decided that, hey, these workload attached policies aren't going to work in this new model. Let's move them to waypoint attached things. And we made similar decisions that have kind of moved us away from these constraints of 100% compatibility, but we haven't actually rethought through the architecture with that constraint lifted. And so I think there's some legacy decisions that were tied to that are suboptimal. We see this, I think, a lot in our discussions that we've had in these past few weeks and months around things that are very hard problems to solve and seem to have no good solutions, which I think are ultimately tied to this. Things like, should we hairpin, right? Like, and on one hand, we have to hairpin because we said that we're going to enforce all authorization policies at L7 layer because we wanted compatibility with the Istio APIs. But on the other hand, hairpinning is this crazy mess that no one wants to do and is super complicated and is a security risk, right? So there's no win-win there, and that's because of the architecture decisions we've made that have evolved over time. So yeah, let's see, hairpin, covered that. So in the end, we're kind of in the state where the policy attachment's kind of weird. Like you attach it to a waypoint, which kind of works, but it's not really how users think about things, I think. Like you don't attach policies to a service account in really any API in Istio, and I don't think users really want to do that. They're just kind of forced to do it by the way that we've mapped waypoints, right? But users think about things like services, namespaces, maybe workloads, depending on what exactly they're doing and how familiar they are with the Istio concepts. But even in Kubernetes, attaching things to workloads is kind of uncommon. We either do hairpinning or we kind of break out-of-mesh clients. Out-of-mesh clients are still kind of broken anyways because they can't actually go to a waypoint as call a service through a waypoint. They can only call a workload through a waypoint, which means that they can't really integrate with the mesh at all. And the implementation is really hard in Istio. Like we have this hairpinning stuff. Waypoints need to handle routing for all pods, which is really hard to implement, and we've done a poor job at it. So we have like each pod IP and listeners. And waypoints aren't just standard gateways, right? They're special Istio things. So in theory, a standard gateway, just an Nginx or anything implementing the gateway API, for example, could be a waypoint, right? And that could enable a lot of different kind of cool integrations into Istio. If someone wants to plug in there, I don't know, some cool vendor is doing some awesome things in gateways, that's fine. We should let them use those waypoints and add value. But today we can't because waypoints are not standard gateways, right? They kind of are similar. They have a lot of similar ideas, but they're totally incompatible. We don't use the APIs to configure them, anything like that. So the idea that I'm proposing is that we move waypoints to be from being attached to workloads, which today we basically say all traffic to this workload goes through the waypoint. And we instead change them to be attached to services, which is to say that we make a service and say this service is implemented by the waypoint, and all traffic to that service goes to the waypoint. And if a workload wants to enforce that traffic, well, yeah, go ahead, Gautam.
We can discuss further if we attach to service or if service is attached to gateway or if they are first class, because there is also some idea to kind of deprecate some functionality in service and evolve service, and gateway would be the replacement or be the entry point. And I think gateway should be the actual.
Yeah, I think the way I worded it was probably slightly not accurate. I wasn't necessarily saying so there is some way that the users will configure this from an API perspective that we should debate. And I don't have, even in the stock, a solid proposal for that. I have a sketch of a bad idea that gives a rough direction. But definitely think we need to discuss that further. But I'm trying to.
One thing that is clear in the gateway API specification is that gateways specify host names. What the host names are, it's up to implementation, but I think we can agree that this part should be supported. So if I create a gateway of any kind, including waypoint, and I specify food.service.cluster.local, that gateway would.
Yeah, maybe let me go through this, and I think it will probably say
okay.
what you're saying. I explained it poorly, and I think I can explain it better if I actually followed the doc instead of trying to remember what I wrote. So if people read my blog post about waypoints from the hard way or whatever, and this is pretty much copied from that, but I think it'll still be useful to go over at least quickly. So the idea that I'm trying to show here is like, if we didn't have ambient, there was no such thing as Istio, like how would you actually go implement this architecture where waypoints are attached to services today? And then we can talk about, okay, what's missing to actually get to the user experience we want, and like what value can Istio add? So if we start with the example setup, you have like kind of your client, you've got Echo service, and a couple of different pods, right? We want to make it so that the traffic from the client to the service goes through some L7 load balancer where we can apply canary rules, L7 policy, observability, etc. And then we also want that secure transport. So we have end-to-end mutual TLS, authentication policies, authorization policies, etc. Right? So the secure transport part, we'll just ignore that for now. Not because it's not important, but it's not necessarily strictly tied to this. So fortunately, to actually deploy this L7 load balancer, there's already a standard API for this, right? You can, with any implementation, you can deploy some gateway, you can attach an HTTP route to it, and then we can route traffic to various backends. So at this point, you have this setup. Like the client can either choose to go through the gateway, or they can go through the standard service. They can get L7 functionality or just L4 functionality. Now, you probably want your clients to go through the gateway in all cases, right? Or at least in most cases. So, on one approach, you could just say, go tell all the clients to use the new name, and roll that out everywhere. That can be challenging. Like one of the ways that used to work today is that it's fairly transparent to map things. But there's still kind of easier ways to do it that are somewhat transparent. For example, we could do, Kubernetes allows making C names with external name. So we can basically do a DNS redirect from the Echo service to the gateway, and basically enforcing, not enforcing, but suggesting that all clients that are using standard DNS go to the gateway just by doing the same standard, curl service name. Now, if we want to do a secure transport, we could obviously do TLS in the gateway. That's part of the spec. But we don't, that would require changing all your clients to do TLS as well, right? Which is not terrible if you have access to the code. It's usually quite easy to send TLS traffic. But generally, we want to do mutual TLS, and then you end up with how do I get the client certs and all this stuff, and that's where people usually bring service mesh in. However, if we start to layer on something like zTunnel, we can have the zTunnel add the TLS for you, right? This doesn't necessarily even need to be HBone. zTunnel could add standard TLS and integrate with the standard waypoint. Now, whether we actually do that or do normal HBone and then sandwich it so that the either one's fine. I didn't talk about sandwiching here because at the time I wrote this, which was like a month ago, sandwiching wasn't cool, but it seems like sandwiching is back in and there's been some work from other people to do it. So either one's fine. This is just an example. And now just an example, like because we now have an L7 thing, like you can add L7 policies to the waypoint, of course. In this case, I did an authorization policy, but if this was an Nginx gateway, you could do cool Nginx policy, whatever. Now, the last thing, though, is that we told the clients to use the gateway with DNS, but we didn't enforce that they actually go through it, right? So the final step would be the enforcement, which you could use network policy if you're just using, I was trying to go not Istio type things, but it could also be an authorization policy, obviously for Istio. So here I use network policy and say all traffic must go through the waypoint proxy. And a cool thing is that we can also exclude some workloads. So we could say, for example, Prometheus, I want to be able to go directly, or maybe I have some trusted client that's high performance, that's maybe in my namespace or something. Exclude those ones or certain ports, things like that. So it's actually quite a bit more flexible than the existing waypoint model where it's kind of all or nothing. Okay, so if we do all that, like what's missing? What can Istio add for value? I think there's kind of two things. One is the user experience is, it's not the hardest thing in the world, but it's still kind of burdensome to do this if you have many services, many workloads. And it's not really opinionated. So while you could do it today, there's a lot of different ways you could do it. And so you won't really end up with one thing that's like this consistent way that everyone is deploying these L7 services. You'd end up with kind of this mess of everyone doing things slightly differently, maybe slightly incorrectly. I can't imagine the endless amount of GitHub issues we get about people misconfiguring things. So there's a lot of value we can add on making this a lot easier and seamless, especially with things like the secure transport. And the other thing is workload policies, right? Everything here is about services. Like you send traffic to the service, and the service is now a physical instantiation at the waypoint, which enforces policies. But there are cases where we don't use services, right? We go directly to a workload. In those cases, we don't have an L7 proxy on the way, right? So in this current doc, I had mostly focused on service cases. Towards the end, which we won't have anywhere near enough time to talk about, I talked about some ways that we can enable these workload policy cases. In my mind, they're not super common because they'd have to be, typically things that are using headless services don't tend to be HTTP things as well that would benefit from going through a gateway. They tend to be databases and things that one aren't doing HTTP, or even if they are, they value the high performance versus policies. But there's certainly cases that may benefit from it. So I underestimated how long this would take, actually. I mentioned like everything above this part was kind of fairly thought out. For how we actually go about doing this, there's all sorts of different APIs to debate. I gave a very rough sketch that is meant to be a dumb name to make it clear that I don't think this is what we want. Exactly, it's just kind of an indication of what we want, right? You could imagine that instead of making a service or in addition to a service, a user could create a super service or L7 service or HTTP service. And they say, look, here's my backends. They're, the app equals hello ones. I've got this port 80 port. And then we'd automatically get assigned in status some DNS name, maybe an IP address, potentially. Costin, I think, was mentioning a similar idea of using an actual gateway to do this. That's also a valid option. So all sorts of ways that we could expose this as a higher level API. But then the idea is that this API would then derive all the steps I listed above that you could do manually for you. So in the end, what you have is pure standard gateway API gateways. They're just normal gateways. They can be Nginx, Google Load Balancer, AWS Load Balancer, Istio Gateway, Glue Gateway, whatever. And then we facilitate kind of the mapping to make sure that clients will start using that gateway and that is kind of seamless from end to end. The benefits we get is everything's super standard, right? You have a ton of interoperability with other projects if you want. Istio is just using all standard APIs. What Istio is adding is kind of the glue, the composition, the patterns, the secure transport, and of course we'll have an implementation of a gateway as well. So that's the idea. Maybe we expand the time cap 5 minutes because leaving 1 minute for comments seems unnecessarily short. But I will stop talking now. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so obviously I'm super supportive of this proposal. I want to mention some of the other discussions we've been having is to have a virtual gateway or a bypass of the gateway where proxyless gRPC or sidecars or other things could see that we have a gateway with some special class or something, and then use direct routes or do other optimization. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical gateway. And also, it could be a physical gateway combined with, sidecar or proxyless or any combination where we reserve the right to apply the policies at different points in the path, not necessarily to implement it in a certain way. So it's an intent of how it should behave. That name should be routed. Some authorization should happen, but we keep it a bit more flexible in how it is implemented.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there should be ways that a given service can be accessed directly or through the gateway. How we expose that, whether it's based on the client's capabilities or if they call a different DNS name, that's up to debate. I was kind of favoring the latter. I think you were favoring the former. I think
we can discuss it. I mean, in the end, both are possible with the API surface.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
user can express the
Absolutely.
intent, so it doesn't matter.
But that's what I was trying to show, like with that Prometheus
yeah.
example, for example. So yeah, definitely agreed.
But the other point I want to make is that everything in this document is possible today. There is nothing that will require massive changes or changes. It's just we need to commit to document it as best practice, to put documentation, to add tests and all that, and maybe do small optimizations here and there.
Yes, that's basically true. For if you don't need the secure transport layer, everything here is trivial to do today. If we want the automatic secure transport without the applications changing, we either need a few tweaks to ztunnel or to get the sandwich stuff working, which I guess you could do the sandwich. You just want to get the identity in the gateway. So the super service, despite it being a clear placeholder, I do have kind of a prototype I've been working on that is just a simple controller translating this to kind of the manual steps to kind of play around with the ideas. And mostly work just made a few tiny tweaks to Istio, but for the most part, it's like Costin said, it's we're just adding glue basically. Go ahead, Louis.
Obviously, I put a lot of comments in the doc already. We're obviously going to have to talk about stateful set, right, pretty seriously. I don't think it's as rare a case, right, as you noted. I actually talked to quite a lot of customers, use it quite extensively at HTTP, not just for databases. So that is a real thing. I think we have to be right. So there's kind of two threads here, right? Like there's decoupling of the secure transport and what it means to be a gateway, right? Which is an architectural thing. Then there's the Istio APIs and their evolution and what they mean from a compatibility standpoint, right? And I think we all agree that we want to enable alternate API implementations, alternate means of expressing gateway patterns, right? Not just tying users to the Istio one. That's fine. But that should not necessarily be coupled to the Istio API support, right? Those two things, right? There should be something that gives users gateways that implement the Istio APIs. There can be things that give users gateways that implement other APIs. That's fine too. And that's kind of more like an architectural separation of concerns discussion, rather than a what APIs should Istio have or not have discussion.
I put some comments. I mean, for personalization and stateful sets, I completely agree. We need to support them, but that should be a standard. Gateway already has some personalization support in progress, and that's effectively stateful sets. And for the rest, yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, we need to support multiple classes, including Istio, and have some flexibility.
I don't know that I fully agree that you could replace all stateful sets with sticky sessions. Like if they're doing like clustering and stuff, they can't just. It's not just about being sticky to something, right? They actually want to hit a specific one. But so I do think that this is not like, even though this proposal as is does not cover direct to workload cases, it doesn't mean that we can't support that, right? They can be kind of decoupled. You can have a different API expression that we can discuss in some way, shape, or form that says this workload, all traffic that's directly to the workload goes through this thing, right? I haven't sketched it out how we could do it, but it certainly doesn't seem impossible to add. And I'm fine to say that before we do this, we need to figure that out.
It seems like stateful sets are something we have to solve in Ambient with or without this proposal. Like right now, we have no real client-side layer 7 support in Ambient because of the way that we've structured the API. We've said that there may be some interest in adding that with a slightly different API, particular to client-side. But that need doesn't appear to change with this proposal. Am I understanding that right, Louis?
I think it's probably fair to say that John's proposal has not tried yet to resolve the stateful set or just direct workload addressed issue. In Ambient, there are things in flight that are trying to resolve some of the API compatibility issues, right? So that users don't lose some capability for stateful sets, right? So if you think about stateful sets, right, generally speaking, load balancing and client-side routing are irrelevant. What you care about are authorization policy and telemetry, for the most part. Authorization policy being the stickier one, right? But there's some of the sandwich work and other things that are going on architecturally should help to resolve some of that feature gap with existing Istio capability, right? And that's just about being compatible as possible with existing Istio APIs and use cases. So I think some of that gap can be bridged. So I think ultimately we'll probably find that we don't have a very large gap with existing stateful set support for direct address workloads in terms of authorization policy or telemetry. But some things still need to be proven out.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Costin, and then I think Lynn, and then we'll probably wrap it up, not because we're done discussing it, but because we need a lot longer to discuss and we don't have time.
I put in comments, you can skip it.
Okay, yeah, go ahead then.
Okay, I just have a quick question. Didn't digest this enough. So the super service you're proposing, that's only for going directly to the pod, for example, hybrid services. But if I'm not doing directly to pod, you're not proposing any API change. It's just under the cover, the construction and the composition is different. Is that correct?
No, so first, one thing I want to make clear is that I'm not proposing we ship something called super service.
Right,
they need to make a stupider name. But no, this would be like either a replacement for the Kubernetes service or in addition to a Kubernetes service to make it kind of HTTP through the waypoint. So this is for service. This is not solving the case where you're not going through service, which is what Louis had concerns about, which we should address. I have some, I think, notes at the bottom of maybe have some ideas, but I haven't fully sketched out what that might look like. So what this, if you create a service like this, what it would do is it would spin up the waypoint, configure it all the proper ways, and then tell clients to start going through that waypoint. And then we could decide if we want to add some enforcement mechanism here, or if we have users do that out of band, or all those sorts of details on the API. But the real intent here is that we have some sort of higher level API that orchestrates kind of the manual steps that we do to set up what is really not even an ambient pattern. It's really a middle proxy. Like it's a very classic architecture for services, right?
So user would not be using the Istio waypoint to deploy a waypoint with this proposal. Is that right? They would
So with this proposal,
service.
yeah, the concept of Istio waypoint, like we could call them waypoints if we want, but all the code, everything for Istio waypoint would be deleted. What you would have instead is a gateway, a standard gateway. Like Istio, of course, offers a gateway, so that would be the default that we use is an Istio gateway. But it would be no different than an ingress gateway, other than presumably it doesn't have an external IP address. Right, it's the exact same thing. It's just configured with different routes based on the use case, right? And it doesn't have to be used to a gateway. You could use whatever gateway implementation you want. Like under the hood, this super service would create a gateway object, and we could configure somewhere, like to say what class you would want it to be with the default of Istio. That way it's kind of swappable, which I think Louis' doc that we'll talk about in a second will cover some of that in some form. So let's move on to that. Obviously, the doc I've shared is kind of a lot to digest. So please take a look, comment on the doc or somewhere, and maybe we can discuss a bit more next week once people have had some time to read it. All right, feel free to take over, Louis, but if not, I'm sharing. So.
Louis, you are muted.
Desperately trying to unmute myself, clicking all the wrong buttons. Yeah, so this document is a kind of a more architectural, decomposition focused, right, low level thing that's designed to facilitate more implementation variety in the waypoint pattern as understood by a contract between the lower level networking layer, the Z-tunnel layer, and the waypoint layer, right? The Z-tunnel layer being aware of the waypoint layer, right? It knows about them, it talks to them, or it talks past them sometimes. And then the waypoint layer being the layer where L7 policy is expressed. And so, you know, we obviously have the Istio APIs, and we have Istio as an implementation of a waypoint controller, but there can be other waypoint controllers. And in fact, that's probably something we should facilitate. We could also allow for the fact that there may be other secure networking implementations down the road that will integrate with waypoints. I haven't gone into too much detail about what those options might be, but this document is really trying to codify a contract between the two layers that allows for some implementation variety along two axes, right? The first axis being having an alternate waypoint implementation. I guess you could normally say that also allows, by definition, for an alternate Z-tunnel or secure transport layer implementation, but I didn't go into too much detail about that. And the other primary access being, okay, if other waypoints want to choose to implement support for or not support for certain Istio APIs, how should they go about doing that? And you know, certainly for folks like Google and Microsoft, right, they have large fleets of management and infrastructure to run like L7 middle boxes as SaaS, and they probably want to use that as waypoints. And so enabling them to do so is probably healthy, right, for them. It's probably healthy for the customer. And so what's important then is to kind of codify how this should all happen, as well as giving Istio a way itself to innovate and change and maybe provide alternate waypoint implementations or alternate paths for APIs or alternate API support paths down the road as well, while still allowing for a codification and standardization of, right, with the waypoint pattern, how much of the existing Istio API surface can we support and make that clear to users. So John, if you don't mind scrolling down. So really, this is just some basic stuff, kind of introducing the two layers, right? Which there really are two layers now in the system, right? There's the L4 layer, or what we call the zero trust networking layer, And its job is to take the identity of a workload and ensure that when a workload communicates with something else on the network, that its identity is reliably and securely expressed to who it's talking to. Right, so workloads get identity from the orchestration system effectively. That identity may be converted into other forms, like a Kubernetes jot into a SPIFFE ID or something like those forms. But fundamentally, like, workloads have identity, and our job is to make sure that identity is expressed in the network. That's the role of the Zero Trust networking layer. We do some things in Istio, in zTunnel, to make sure that metadata about workloads that is useful for policy decisions is conveniently and efficiently shared on the network in a way that can be trusted by peers, so they can apply policy against attributes of a workload. So that's kind of a value add that we provide in zTunnel today. But that's essentially the role of the system at L4 or L3, L4. You can debate whether it's L3, L4. And then there's the waypoint layer, and the waypoint layer is a policy layer, right, that an owner of an identity domain today, right, and I don't, right, whether it's a service account or a Kubernetes namespace, or maybe something higher level down the road, but for the moment, those are the ones that we deal with, can express policy. And then there's a contract between the two layers to say, look, if I've expressed this policy, I want to ensure that all traffic that's subject to that policy goes through the enforcement point. And that's the role of the waypoint, right? It's a policy enforcement point. Today in Istio, right, with the sidecar model, there's, as Gon kind of talked about a little bit before, there's really two types of traffic. There's two service traffic and two workload traffic. Traditionally, the Istio APIs cover both. And for compatibility reasons, to the extent possible, it would be nice to make sure that at least that implementations are capable of supporting both use cases, while also allowing for waypoint implementations to declare that they can't support one of these use cases. So, like, harking back a bit to John's example, if there was a waypoint implementation that could not support workload addressed traffic, it couldn't act as a forward proxy for a stateful set, that it could declare that it didn't support the Istio authorization policy bindings for that use case, right? And that would be made clear by a status and kind of expression of API support mechanisms that are being codified as part of the gateway API. We also have to be careful to think about Istio as being, the sum of these two things being, a value, like an intrinsic value proposition on its own. Right, Istio was born to provide both sets of capabilities, both the L7 policy control and the L4 security and identity management parts. And so we want to make sure that these things work well together, right, and not lose that aggregate value proposition, while still allowing for fungibility at either layer. And then the rest of the proposal, if you go down the doc, is a pretty mechanical set of steps and constraints about how to allow this to happen, and how Istio should operate in a world where this is happening. So there's basically a set of contracts, conformance rules, if you will, right? Because this is really a conformance specification. Sean, if you don't mind scrolling down a little bit, where we talk about the contracts between the layers. And I break this out into a few different categories. So there's, the zTunnel layer has to know how to discover and talk to the waypoints. And so there's a set of naming conventions that are proposed here, a set of constraints on how the endpoints for waypoints should be discovered, if a different waypoint controller is automating them, which, we can drill into the details of those and you can see a bunch of comments. So there's that. There's this kind of discovery by the zTunnel layer of what waypoints are in effect and what traffic should be sent to them. And we go a little further down. maybe a bit to the next section. These are examples. We can skip past this. And there is, how should authentication occur between waypoints and the secure networking layer? And there's really two mechanisms that we have that we are working with today, right? One is the waypoint must implement the HBone protocol. And the other is the waypoint is sandwichable. And how to do that? So we just talk about how that composition is going to work in the data path. And then the last path, and maybe last part, and sorry, maybe the most relevant part to potential waypoint, alternate waypoint implementers is how can you express your compatibility with the Istio APIs? Right, so Istio has an API surface, right, that's documented and says what we support. Obviously there's going to be some variation between what we supported with the sidecar-based model and the ambient-based model. But if we, as a rough rule of thumb, say, look, Istio supports all of the Istio API model, whether that, and that includes, let's say, 2 service and 2 workload traffic, and you're an implementer of a waypoint and you cannot support 2 workload traffic, how can you express that you don't support the API bindings for certain use cases? Fortunately, the Gateway API has done a lot of work to kind of codify how, when APIs are or are not supported, can be expressed back to users as status. And so we can rely on that mechanism, although some of it's still a little bit in flight, to codify how a waypoint implementer should express what it does and does not support. And so there's some detail here about how that should be done and conformance rules about how to do that. And of course, then there's APIs that are not Istio APIs at all. And how should a waypoint implementation that has its own APIs express that it's supporting those APIs, right? Following the patterns described in the Gateway API model. Hopefully not speaking too out of turn, but in terms of the actual complexity of what would take to implement this specification in Istio, it's not super complicated, right? It's effectively a set of well-defined contracts between the layers, and its job is to allow alternate implementations to express their limitations or their added value. So it's very architectural. But it creates degrees of freedom, right, between the 2 layers of the system that allow for innovation. And also compatibility, right? So one of the challenges, right, if you want to be an Istio vendor, but you cannot use, let's say, Istio stock implementation of the waypoint, you have to use your managed whatever middle box to implement it. And there's some feature in an Istio API that you can't support. You can claim Istio compatibility as long as you follow the rules here for conformance, and you document for your users the limitation of your system, right? And so we don't, like Istio and what Istio supports and what Istio delivers, because it is both effectively now a standard and a reference implementation, right? That creates a little tension, particularly for vendors. So having conformance rules about support allows users to understand what they're getting if they move between implementations. Right, obviously Istio in its reference implementation and what we ship in open source will be what a lot of users will expect. But if they're going to get something different, then it's documented, well understood, and users can engage with their vendor around the features. And vendors can therefore also get some freedom to provide value add. So I think that's the summary, John.
Yeah, it makes sense. If we trying to think what this looks like with the previous proposal I just presented, in my mind, it seems like there's kind of 3 degrees of Istio-ness for a waypoint. It's like the maximum Istio one is you use the actual Istio reference architecture. Obviously, that conforms to all of Istio's requirements as it's the reference. Then you could use a different waypoint, but that is Istio compatible, in which case it has to either be compatible or say how it's not, and you said how we do that. But a third one that's not really here, but is what is possible with the previous proposal, is that you use a completely different implementation that doesn't even necessarily know about Istio at all, has no guarantees at all of Istio support, and instead is tied only to gateway API conformance, and you're kind of choosing explicitly to use a non-Istio waypoint. Does that kind of align with how you would think those things interact?
Yeah, I think there's, right, I assumed, right, some interoperability, right, because of, you know, the summing, like the L4 secure zero trust layer interoperating with the policy enforcement layer in a consistent fashion being a strong value proposition of Istio. There is obviously that other case where maybe you break that a little bit, right? And you get a different set of structural security guarantees that, right, it's hard to know what to call those. And so I want to be a little careful to say, look, like there aren't just three linear options, right? Like there's still a whole is greater than the sum of the parts by putting the waypoint and L4 security pieces together in a strong and well-defined way with structural guarantees.
Yeah.
We're obviously trying to do things with the sandwich to make it easier for arbitrary gateway implementations to exist in that world. If we start to loosen the strong structural security guarantee between the L4 layer and the L7 layer, right, we start to lose, right, some of our ability to reason about the security properties of the system. We can still support such a system, right? You can have a waypoint that doesn't implement HBO. I didn't put it here. And that could just be an arbitrary gateway, right? And then what you're saying is, well, we're just going to send it traffic, right? But
yeah,
we don't know how to identify it. And therefore, we don't really know how to trust it, right? And so then it's up to administrators of the system and others to document and make guarantees to users about why that, you know, injection of that waypoint into the system is trustable, right? And that's, I'm not sure that's a thing we should call Istio. It's a thing we could technically support. And they ask us, and there are ways to go about having other ways of identifying and authenticating with these systems, although they're not strictly like MTLS and HBone are effectively synonymous in my world, right? So like JWT is a little trickier on that front. It's perfectly possible to have other secure transports, so I'm not ruling those out at all. So like, as long as we can strongly reason about the identity of a waypoint, we can have other transport implementations. That's fine. I don't want to
Also, I want to point out that at least SPIFFE is now treating JWT's equivalent with MTLS certificates, because they also realized they need to cross gateways and to pass SPIFFE identity through other means than handshake. And what I put in many comments in this doc is standards. I mean, we cannot build an interoperability layer telling people you must implement Istio weird behavior and APIs and modification of the standards. We can build an interop layer by specifying, hey, standard gateway API, standard MTLS, standard JWT. This is how you can express Istio extensions, vendor extensions, if you support them. But fundamentally, we should base everything new we do on standards, not on Istio things. That's
yeah,
really, I don't see a viable.
I mean, we've been very careful with HBone, right? HBone is a standard, right, effectively.
Well, kind of. It's a modification of a standard that is not interoperable with anything except Istio. So once we have an implementation of whatever we call HBone that works with a browser, I'll believe it. But I want to see a Chrome browser connecting to a gateway speaking HBone, connecting further to an egress gateway using Squid. Then it is standard. I mean, it's interoperable, prove interoperability. Otherwise, it's just an Istio thing with weird things in IP instead of host names and other weird behavior.
I agree. We have some work to do, but we are at least trending in the right direction there.
Yeah.
Like we're well aware, like we can use MTLS for HTTP, but when we start to do TCP tunneling or other protocols, right, things start to get a little trickier. So there are limitations of the standards as well. But we can certainly, like this document certainly allows for a waypoint to implement only MTLS and be a TCP receiver of traffic. So, we could certainly try to start to codify that. Istio itself, like what we ship, the software we ship, right, there are only so many protocols we, Istio, are going to be able to support. And so we have to be a little circumspect, right, about how many things we expect the Z-tunnel L4 layer that we ship to interoperate with how many different waypoint transport layers we ship. Sandwich right now is the most flexible way we have of doing that. We're still trying to prove some of those details out, but I think that looks pretty good from an interoperability standpoint, because it really just looks like the network to the gateway implementation. But there's probably some refinement to be done there. But it's certainly not meant to be exclusive, right? But I am also trying to be pragmatic about what we can and cannot ship, and what we can and cannot ship in each layer.
Yeah, so I guess like going back, if we had the sandwich, like you could have stock Nginx today and it just wouldn't read the identity, right? And as long as you don't need to use the identity, it's fine. Like it's not great, it doesn't offer all the properties of Istio, but it seems reasonable to me. And we definitely encourage, things to be more on the spectrum of Istio-ness, and the company I work at would certainly not be on the Nginx side where we have nothing. Just to be clear, I don't actually care that much about the use case. It's more that we can enable it, and the fact that we can interop with arbitrary gateways is a good sign that we've made a flexible and layerable system. So not that users should use it per se.
Yeah, and it would be nice if there was a standard for, the network layer to express network identity to the workload that was consuming the network. That is something we could try and push on a standards front at some point. I just don't see anything really there today, so we're kind of inventing a little bit. But yeah, I mean, certainly as a validation of this architecture, right, you could go and create an Nginx-based waypoint with a static manual configuration, right, and be able to show that it worked, at least in terms of traffic receipt and traffic forwarding. I wouldn't recommend anybody does it for the same reasons John just mentioned. And we still want Istio to be this, whole is greater than sum of the parts thing on the security front. So I don't want to dilute that message. So if others want to go and implement waypoints, I think we as Istio's community should recommend that they get the identity when they're in the sandwich, and we show them how to do it. And that would be best practice. But if someone chose not to do it, they are free to not have security.
Did we agree how we choose to? I mean, is it AJ proxy plus MDS, or what is the final?
I suspect we'll probably have more than one mechanism, and we'll have to document a couple of them. But right now, HA proxy and whatever the
metadata servers.
Yes, those two.
Some metadata servers. Those okay. As long as we are aligned on this, because those are clearly well established standards.
Well, the metadata service is not a standard, but it's a common practice. I think that's probably what
de facto. I mean,
yes,
everyone supports it. So it's AJ proxy is also not a standard. So it's both of them are broadly.
No, they wrote an RFC eventually and sent it to the IETF.
Well, not IETF, and I don't think it's an IETF yet.
Anyway, yes, those two. And so it would, right? So obviously there's a bunch of things in here, right? There's some important details I think people should go through, but that's the spirit of the proposal. Then there's what should Istio do for its own waypoints, right? Istio is free to take advantage of all, or to support as much of its API as possible, right? And I think that's, for the good of our users, migrating from the sidecar model, the less migration pain we give them, right, the better off they are. We'll obviously end up debating in the details about how much to do. But I would certainly lean towards doing as much as we can. I think that's healthy. But vendors are now free to say, well, we can't do that in their implementation. And here's how they say it, which is what this document is trying to codify. And we should also probably, so this is conformance, and we should also provide an example showing how something else should be used. A trivial one, because we don't want, like, it's not our responsibility to maintain lots of complex waypoint implementations. But we should have conformance tests, and Istio should be conformant to the rules here about how it should say whether it is or is not supporting its own APIs, right? So Istio has to pass its own conformance tests too, which is an important thing.
Hey, you keep saying Istio APIs, and I think that's where I most strongly disagree with. I mean, not disagree, but I'm confused because Istio APIs mean many things to many people. There is experimental, the behavior, the backward compatibility with 0.5 strange do not verify TLS on egress. We need to be very clear that the standard API is a gateway API to express routes and gateway and so forth. There are Istio policies that have V1 API, and there are Istio policies that are still experimental. And even Istio may choose to not support all Istio APIs in some profiles. So John had a proposal.
Yeah, no, I mean, like we have already discussed, right? And it's part of the ambient beta roadmap, what the API targets are. Right? This is clearly for ambient only, because this is only right? Because this is
raising a level here. We're raising the bar. Yeah, absolutely. So you're raising the bar. You're saying it's waypoints, and it's either a further subset of ambient. I mean, it's basically some vendor extensions with different level of stability, and each of them individually can be supported or not as defined by the gateway specification. Core versus extended.
So that's vendor, right? And obviously, it's very hard to, like, there's a set of APIs that are very widely used in Istio, right? And then there's a set of APIs that we've all agreed it's probably okay to start deprecating or replacing. And then there's the general, right, we would like you to use the Gamma APIs because it's a better compositional model. And right, the primary APIs in Istio that we end up talking about, right, are mostly authorization policy and virtual service, right? There's also service entry, which, right, we don't have an easy replacement for in Kubernetes today. So we see no way of deprecating, right? There is no competing proposal in Kubernetes that's viable right now. So those are the three big ones, right? Those are the ones that users depend on the most, right? We have other ancillary APIs like the telemetry API, Envoy filter, right? And other things that users do use. And I think it's reasonable that they expect that there be some form of support for those APIs. But we can document the limitations of them, and that's what's captured in the kind of progress to beta doc. There was a big discussion point around whether we could implement Envoy filter, authorization policy for workload selection. There's still a couple of things pending on the sandwich to see if that's viable or not. If it is viable, I would lean towards supporting as much of it as we can. Because it would ease transition for users, and because there's a real security concern, right, around workload selection and being dependent on services as your only means of policy enforcement point when workloads are addressable by other means. But those are in the details, Costin, right? And I think we've already been over quite a few of those. As far as I'm aware, it is really only authorization policy that has outstanding questions, for the most part, for ambient to progress to beta. And that's Istio, right? A vendor can say, I don't support any of those things. Or here's my other APIs to do those same things.
But critically, I think what you're saying is that they also could not. They could say, we directly support these Istio APIs. That's interesting. Yep. Do we get the sense that there are vendors who would care to do that?
To not support some of the Istio APIs?
No, to support some of the Istio APIs. Like when I had spoken with you about this in the past, my focus was on data plane compatibility, not on API compatibility. I'm curious about the impetus for that focus.
Istio is a reference implementation, so a lot of people use it and expect to get the reference implementation behaviors, right? Particularly when they run in multiple environments, right? Or they're not single vendor dependent. So yeah, there's a lot of market pressure, I think, still by virtue of the fact that Istio is a reference implementation. Like just like in Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes is itself a reference implementation in many respects. And that creates a lot of market pressure on vendors of Kubernetes who may have alternate infrastructural implementations of aspects of Kubernetes.
That's helpful.
So I think, right, there's Istio, and what Istio provides is its reference implementation, which will create market pressure. And then there's vendors who can choose to react to that market pressure in different ways. And that's their prerogative. That's totally fine.
And just so I have this correct in my head, so basically what you're saying is current gateway, gamma, whatever, is not expressive enough to declare, for waypoints to declare things that we need to know they support. So this is essentially Istio-specific extensions to do that in a contractual way. And if, for instance, the gateway/gamma stuff, eventually caught up and like identity was more a core part of the spec, then we can roll into that. And then, it's sort of a similar thing of like, we're a little bit ahead of where that is. We need this capability, we'll add it. But then if it gets backfilled into gateway or whatever, then we can just dot that as the same kind of thing.
Yeah, so Istio can choose its API migration path for its implementation, and a vendor can choose a different API migration path for their implementation.
Right. Gotcha. Okay.
And users don't end up completely confused by what's going on. I also don't want to pretend like Istio will create reference implementation pressure on vendors, and that's okay. That's fine, right? That's what we want to happen. Right? There's no reason for Istio to be a bad implementation, but vendors need some choice, some flexibility.
I don't think, I think Gateway API, it's a very good start, and I don't think it's as incomplete as it sounds. I mean, it like previous discussion with John about...
I'm not making no assertions about whether, like, I think in the long run, Gateway API and its compositional model will become the API that the Istio reference implementation recommends to users with Istio's own extensions to it. I think there's some gaps today. Right? There are clearly some gaps today, right? Like there is no authorization policy part of the Gateway API. So Istio has its own extension.
There's not a gap. I mean, it's just something left to the vendors and left to the standards. I mean, there is a standard for JOTs, there is a standard for passing identity.
Sure.
There is no need for Gateway API to cover telemetry or to cover authorization, because there are other working groups in Kubernetes focused on authorization and telemetry.
Right, but Istio still has this mission to be like the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and we're going to push users towards a consistent expression of these solutions that works well together holistically. Right.
But hopefully based on standards. I mean, hopefully by adopting the standards for each area, and yes, putting them together, harmonizing them, whatever, but not reinventing standards like telemetry or authorization if other standards exist.
I mean, there exist standards today for like hotel collection, right, is a standard, but describing how to annotate network traffic, to flexibly configure the degree to which telemetry that should be configured, right? There's no standard for that. That's something that Istio does.
And they're working on it. I mean, it's not. I mean, and it belongs in telemetry working groups and belongs in other.
Well,
we provided a start like a gateway. I mean, it's not that we are
I would actually disagree with that, Costa. Sometimes Istio is actually the best place to pull these things together because we have a more holistic view and we deliver more value by doing that. That's not always true. Like when there's a well-defined standard like HTTP, there should clearly be a well-defined HTTP routing API. But when there's not a well-defined standard, right, which, when you talk about like multi-service communication and how to annotate traffic and how to extract varying degrees of telemetry based on context, right? Now you're talking about many standards interplaying. You're talking about like OpenAPI and OpenTelemetry and JOP and all these other things, right? And what matters more there is the ability to flexibly or consistently synthesize. That's because of where Istio exists in the system and what it does, it actually can do more than any standard, any one standard, in a certain way. And that's where we end up creating APIs.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I mean, with the first part, we create APIs. We may create some APIs, but long term we should, defer to the proper. Like with virtual service, we created virtual service. Yes. Kubernetes API adopted the HTTP route. We created telemetry. Now the Open Telemetry is adopting some of it. We are the starting point, but we are not the ending point. And for interoperability, it must be a standard, not an Istio standard.
When there's a one-to-one mapping between an API and a standard, sure. When there is not, that's where we innovate.
Okay. Until there is one, let's say.
Sure. So I guess the first kind of overarching question, right? Hopefully this makes sense to everybody. Does anybody have any fundamental objection to this, right? Because at a technical level, this is quite mechanical and hopefully not that difficult to implement. That obviously comes with some cost. I don't want to totally underplay it, but it is to a certain degree like fairly straightforward what's being proposed here, right? It's just a codification to some degree or other of things that we've already done with the introduction of some degrees of freedom and conformance requirements about API status, all of which are things that to some degree or other have already been in flight, but it's just codifying them. Does anybody think this is a bad idea? Okay, I'll take silence as assent because I really hope not. Then the next question, right, because some of the API supportability questions were holding up beta. This at least gives some clarity about how we might start to resolve some of those questions so that we can get to beta, right? Because we want to get past some of the blockers that we have. And as far as I'm aware, the big ones were authorization policy, the sandwich, the CNI thing, and then our ability to show status and the ability to show status on API resources gives us a way to progress features that we can bring to beta. And we still have to look at the bundle of what we bring to beta in terms of the value proposition to the end user, but meets the goal, right, of being able to actually get to a beta without necessarily having to have everything that we may or may not want to have done, which is an important thing because we don't want Ambient to live in alpha to beta limbo indefinitely. Like Ambient's pretty good. We want to get it into the hands of users, and we know that being an alpha is a stumbling block for that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that front too. Or we're over time, and Louis, you should show up, and we'll come back next week. And just please go put comments in the doc.
That sounds right, Louis. A lot of people are dropping, so I think there is some contention on is mesh config the right place to do the class configuration.
Okay.
There are some contention around, does user change their gateway resource as they're moving from different providers? Yeah.
But these are more kind of mechanical things rather than fundamental concerns.
Agreed. Yeah, haven't seen anything fundamental. Maybe we should recircle back next week or offline. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I know Ian is working on some prototype stuff for this. So folks, like if kicking around code and trying it is how it makes you feel warm and fuzzy, then there should be something, right?
Thanks.
Yeah, I have started on at least the mesh config portion of it, and there's an issue for that. So if folks have strong opinions, they can check that out in the Istio API repo and leave comments. I know John had some, but he didn't quite, we didn't get to comments before John had to drop. So.
Okay, great. Obviously, there are many like details to be worked out, right? It's by no means a complete thing. It's kind of more of a framework to get to completeness. So lots of comments are welcome, and I'll try and resolve as many of them as I can while I survive Las Vegas.
All right. Thank you so much, Louis. Thanks everybody for joining, and talk to you all soon. Bye.
Thank you.